So thanks for the great introduction, Grant. So we're just going to show you how we do it. With so many new, shiny, great tools out there, like Content Strategy, Mobile First, Backbone, Ember, Compass, Sass, Bootstrap Foundation, head spinning yet? How about Grunt and Capistrano? So many of these things, it's really easy to lose focus on the bigger picture. Oops. Okay, so with all these new tools, it's really important to focus on the building blocks of collaboration. And these building blocks are design, interface, and development. Now, all these building blocks are really tied together with one thing: user experience.
User experience, there's a lot of talk about it. It reaches outside the internet at this point. I know people in the sort of fashion industry and marketing speaking about it. We're going to show you some deliverables today that you can use to get your hands around the idea. But what we like to think about is there isn't a user experience designer on the team, although that's a really cool label to have. Like having an X in your title is really cool. Everybody wants one. But like the role of project manager, we try to take that role and break it up into pieces, and everybody kind of carries that, one of those pieces.
So we're going to step back a minute and talk about who we are. So basically we have Antonio, Grant, Jesse, and myself. And we've collaborated on several design and development projects over the last year or so, year or 2 years. Yeah. We're loosely based in the East Bay at Tech Liminal. And over the time period of working together, we've really always looked internally at our workflow and trying to smooth those out.
But we're also just like you guys probably. We were here 2 months ago, and we saw some talks, and we decided we could probably do that. Like, we should try to do that. We should try to take the processes that come to us naturally, and even though we're not comfortable with it, try to figure out a way to communicate those ideas to other people who are also learning.
So we're basically on a personal mission to break down some of these traditional silos. And so what do we mean by traditional silos? So traditional silos around in web development, we're talking about user experience people, design people, front-end developers, back-end developers, these silos. Now, what happens during normal cycles of web development is these different silos are working on things concurrently throughout the sprints of a web project. So we like to think of it more in terms of this bottom row here, the collaborative part of it.
How many people are sole proprietors or sort of work for themselves, by themselves on projects?
Lots of people.
Awesome. And how many people work on teams and have to communicate with several people throughout the day? All right, it's a good mix. So Michael and I work primarily with each other and then bring Grant and Antonio into the mix. And so what you guys are probably used to is you do all these things, right? So you're not kind of scared of any of them. So you sort of do them all naturally. When working with teams, what you have to do is you have to start asking for help and start admitting when you're wrong and start getting good at filling in where somebody else isn't good. So this, as you can see in this last timeline, like the first timeline would be a traditional, the way you'd write a proposal, right? You write a proposal and you say user experience design, front-end development, because people are used to seeing those prices. When you run the project, you break it into sprints. But we've noticed this last timeline to be the most accurate. And as you can see, by the end of it, we're all talking over each other. And that's because we're actually working together. So,
all in this together.
Yeah, yeah.
So the first part of the project, we're going to focus on the content. So content is king. Content is where we start diving into this project. We start thinking about content by creating a hypothesis.
How many people are familiar with the term agile development? Sure, cool. How many people know of lean UX? A few more, cool. The idea of the hypothesis was actually quoted from Jeff Gothelf's book on lean UX, and it breaks down projects into very manageable chunks. So rather than trying to take on the whole of your project, you want to take an aspect of your project and break it into a discrete actionable item, which states, we believe blank, filling this feature for blank these people will achieve blank this outcome. And we will know this when we see blank this feedback.
So the important shift to think about here is that we're shifting from a mindset of deliverables to a mindset of outcomes.
You mean the website? The thing, the code you deliver isn't the most important thing?
So like as sole proprietors, you guys are probably used to pricing out the object. When you really get value from your client, like if you were to map out your whole process, if you were to ask them to circle which part of the timeline is the most important to them, it would probably be the end. But as a maker of stuff, we started to get kind of bummed out at the end because it was sort of, it was more and more lackluster, so the process had to fill in. Like, we needed to make sure the process is where we're actually getting our sense of self-worth from the project.
Let alone knowing what feature as a developer you're going to be working on. It helps out with the process, like knowing what the end result is going to be and why I'm going to be building this component.
Why it matters.
Yeah, exactly. Why it matters adds weight to the thing, and it makes me feel good about why I built it.
So it's very refreshing to work on projects where you're actually thinking about outcomes rather than just, this is what I have to do by the end of the day.
So how does this all start? Like, it's pretty like, it might seem kind of vague. But when we get a project, well, the first thing we do is ask lots of questions. And sometimes our clients don't like this because it feels like work to them. They're like, I'm paying you money. Why is the first thing being done my job? But it's the only way we're going to start to speak the same language. And the only way that the content's going to have any value to us. We've got to start learning the adjectives they're using, the users they're talking to, in order for us to even care about the content and sort of stand in for them and have any sort of amount of empathy either for their business goal or for their end user. So that's where the stakeholder interviews come in. And so what we're looking for in our stakeholder interviews is answers that involve honest experience. And so what we go after is emotions. So there's two emotions that we sort of tackle with interviews, and the first is sort of generally categorized as motivations. So one broad question that we'll ask is...
Hang on just a second. Do people know what we mean by stakeholder interviews? I see a lot, most people. Okay. So we're talking about people within the organization, and we're also talking about people like interviewing actual users of the system. So these could be people who are inside or outside the organization.
So a simple statement like, what aspects of the site are most important to you, kicks off the project in a positive way. What you're looking for is desires from your honest desires drawn from experience from your users, and you're looking for language that they use that they all have in common, a vernacular of the sort of stakeholder group. So you might get answers like, we want a site that makes investors happy, and we don't have to keep getting negative reviews about it. You might get a response like that it's easy for, this is from a specific, you might get this response about researchers. So this is from a specific project that we did for a science institute in Berkeley. So they're interested in researchers actually getting online tools. So this is a utility for the users, because right now it's basically impossible. And then again, basic statements like clear information about the research because it's currently muddled. And finally, so you always get a wisecracker who just says everything's important. So all of it, just put it all at the top of the page. That'd be awesome.
So we also take a look at the frustrations of what people are really annoyed at when they're using the site, like what obstacles do they face in finding. This can be a really positive thing. I mean, haters are going to hate, which shouldn't necessarily just discourage you. It should actually be a source of really great information about where are some of the pain points. With this particular science institute that we worked with, there was one particular person who was just very negative about the experience that they.
More than one.
There were a few, but one in particular really stood out, and he ended up turning out to be an incredibly valuable ally to us in really understanding the frustration that other people were going. He was just being the one who was vocal about it.
Sometimes organizations will want to avoid these questions, but they're actually really telling. People get honest when they have issues with something. So, and you'll get actually the answers that we got from the negative questions are actually much more targeted. They can be much more specific. So when people want something, they tend to be sort of more general. But when they don't like something, they can tell you exactly what they don't like. Everybody that we worked for on the site just hated the navigation system. It was actually a set of colored circles along the top of the page that were really not great. And then they'll be really detailed, like this last person who says, overall, I think they, again, hated everything about the site. It lacked visual impact and the navigation system, of course, and they wanted it to be not so flat. Well, this is before flat design, so they might take this back now. So what you're looking for is patterns, and this is like explaining to a developer, you start to speak the same language. Like, when we're talking about UX processes, telling that there's understanding that there's some sort of math behind it, or that it's quantitative and it's not all touchy-feely, creates more of a connection. Okay, so this isn't just you basing on your intuition or some sort of voodoo that this person's more important than another person. You can actually point to the numbers and tabulate these things and show them that there's a real current underneath this stuff.
And what is emerging from this is we get a clear picture of who the users are, we get a clear picture of what the content is starting to look at, and get a clear picture of what the form and layout aspects of the site would be.
Erica Hall has a really great quote that says, and she has a book that I would recommend that we'll put on the resources list called Just Enough Research. It's about explicitly stating the different kinds of interviews you can do, but she says, our job is to comb through the results and find the most common unmet needs. So not just the most important things, but if you want to bring the most value, you want to go after the things that aren't currently recognized by the system.
What else emerges are the concept of epics. So epics would be sort of your major building blocks for the application or website that you're trying to build.
So, and has everybody here heard of user stories? As a show of hands, user stories? And so I didn't actually know the term epics until fairly probably embarrassing recently, but they're big user stories. You take a bunch of user stories and you collect them together, and you've got this sort of Iliad of user stories, which are your epics. And what they do is they allow the product owner to give you broad sweeping statements about the project without getting too specific about what color the buttons need to be, what specific actions they want to do, or sort of nuances of the application. They can give you a broad emotional statement that talks about their wants and needs. So why are we doing that? Why are we asking all these questions? So we've asked the questions, and the good news is the hard work has all been done. We've asked the questions, we've collected the results, we've found repetition, and we've given key pieces of content, key users, and formal elements a quantitative measure. And so this is going to help us along the way to actually creating content hierarchy. Now, what we're going to show you now are two simple systems that we use when we're working on projects. We're not going to talk about conventions like card sorting, wireframing, or site mapping, but these are tools that we use in conjunction with those other elements.
We can direct you some good resources for that if there's people who need information about that.
Yeah. So the first piece we want to do is we want to create a user matrix. And a user matrix is a collection of all of our users, which we have in a list, and that we've laid out across a spectrum. So we'll explain it in more detail in the next slide, but the first thing to get from this is that we've got a negative measure on the left, positive measure on the right and the top. And so from far away, elements that are in the upper right-hand corner have the most value, and elements in the lower left-hand corner aren't as critical. Oh, sorry. So a user matrix, rather than just sort of a straight-up a user modeling, puts our users on two axes. So as you can see in the last slide, two of the axes that we used were financial contribution and sort of amount of sort of expertise. So since we were dealing with a science institute, we basically had researchers and scientists alongside a government agency where they were getting the money from. We had to find a way to measure and how important their input was as to specific pieces of content and certain actions a user needed to take.
Jesse, can you speak a little bit to what those measurements mean on the actual axes?
So,
Are you going to zoom in on that at all?
oh, could we?
Let's see if we can. Without screwing up the display.
So the one that's probably the easiest to understand is in the upper left-hand corner. We have the general public. So there's a lot of them.
I'll try to explain it, because I'm the developer who's like, what's going on here? Why is this important to me? So here's the volume of users. So general public, we have the largest volume of users. And on this axis here, we have influence of users. So reviewers have a lot of influence, and Congress has a lot of influence. But there are fewer reviewers than there are general public. So that's what this matrix starts to illustrate. So as a developer who's like starting to build a development environment, getting this all set up, starting to think about the architecture of the site, and we are going to bring this back to WordPress, but we're thinking about how to set up the development environment to appeal to these users. And like, isn't it incredibly powerful to start thinking about, I understand my users before we even, before we start building the components of the site.
The grid is most useful when you're approaching specific problems, like let's say a subscription to a newsletter or a specific piece of research. So what we want to avoid is a catch-all solution for the entire site or the entire project. We want to give ourselves a tool that we can take a specific user story and then see how that is weighted along the grid.
So from this matrix, we can start taking a look at our content stack. So the stack of the content that we have. So in this particular site, there was a large collection of basically news events, success stories, history, research. And so we knew we had all this content. We knew what it looked like, but we needed to figure out, we needed to have a way to determine like what was the value of that.
So again, like the user matrix, the content stack from the visual in the previous slide is very similar to the mobile view of your content. So the first thing we want to determine is, what is the sequential order of our content? How are people going to read it? What is the visual impact of our content? And that's a different thing. You can have a piece of content that's further down in the sequential order, but you give more of a visual hierarchy to, and then so in the reader's mind, it actually moves its way up in the hierarchy. Jen Simmons, again, from Mule Design, has a great quote that says, very simply, that a content stack's job is to guide a user's understanding from what to do first and to what happens next.
So let's recap a minute before we get into some development stuff. We've established epics, the stories for the site that we're creating. We've established the user matrix and the relationship between the users and the content. We've created our content stack. And then we've created this user experience framework for future research.
So again, like items like a compass or any sort of like navigational element, these aren't answers within themselves as much as they give decisions you're going to make later on in the active building process a kind of weight or gravity. So
now we're going to break it.
So we're trying to get out of the big deliverables game. We know we can't deliver a site done and then walk away. We know we can't hand off a stack of wireframes and walk away. We've got to make sure that each element and part of our site works independently of another element, because the developers keep developing. I keep asking them to stop. But they keep developing because your users keep demanding new functionality.
How many of you guys have been on projects like that where your job is to just create a bunch of Photoshop files and then hand off to somebody? And how often does it come back that it looks like your Photoshop files?
What's that? Quite often, yeah.
That hasn't been our case, so we'll chat afterwards.
I see. So again, since we break things into parts, and we're not dealing with big promises, but we're dealing with a bunch of discrete actions, we can't fail as much, right? So it just helps the team redefine what success and failure is, and helps your client not expect less, but expect differently. Oh, this is really blown out. There's a great picture on this slide that describes, well, this will move on to the next one, because it's the same thing, but in Photoshop. So how do you think responsibly? So all of these elements make sense, again, as ideas, or they make sense when designing just one component. But how do we start designing components like this that act on a various number of displays? So what might not be clear is that the image on the right is a mobile display, a phone. The image on the left is a tablet, and the image in the background is a desktop display. So how do you start embedding logic into your discrete parts? The search element, turns from a form element into a simple trigger. The menu starts to hide, and your logo actually has logic of its own.
So we start thinking of layouts and grids actually as enhancements to
you
systems.
throw your grid away. That's the first.
Yeah, so a grid is actually an enhancement. We start mobile first, and then your grid is an enhancement to that design. So, and the other thing we start to do is, yes, you start to tell a story. You start to focus on one piece at a time, because that's within the view of the device. And the thing that's making a comeback, which I'm really happy about myself, is typography. Because we threw out our horizontal grid, we actually start to pay attention to legibility again. There's this thing called a vertical grid. It's pretty awesome. And it has its own rhythm and a series of repetition and logic the same way a layout grid does. And we start to be able to focus on that again. A really cool effect, too, is you can start thinking about the semantic structure even down into the Photoshop files. So people, like, organizing or thinking about the semantic structure of your markup when you're organizing Photoshop files can really get you to start to think about how that content, how those design elements are going to start laying out within the page.
So HTML5 elements that we found when talking with designers have a more naturally semantic thing that you can get your head around. Like when you're designing a navigation, when you're designing an article, when you're designing a widget, Michael loves this word, they have an inherent thinginess. It's an object that I can drag and drop around the layout. It's a thing that I can change the priority of. And so we actually have our designers semantically label their layers so that a nav is a nav, a header is a header, and a side, and so forth. And even though they might not understand markup yet, they're beginning to speak the same language, and that's going to help the team sort of talk to each other. So which one's better, Michael? Source or layer?
Let me think about it. There's pros and cons for both.
So the pros to working in Photoshop are you have the ability for high fidelity details. If anybody's a fan of Dribble or is on Dribble, you know that designers really love their polish and their nuance. And you can do that faster in Photoshop than you could do in markup. It allows designers to sketch basic markup objects. This is the education process that we're talking about. You can start teaching designers to respect something's thinginess. And it also facilitates a tactile quality to components. This is that drag and drop logic. This is like respecting the integrity and boundaries of an object. If you're going to make a decision about something, this component now has almost like a personality that you don't want to disrupt.
So one con that I think really stands out is Photoshop kind of keeps you detached from the development team. So the sooner you get into like designing within CSS, the sooner you guys start speaking all the same language.
Yeah, and as a developer, I want to know not just what the static designs are like, I also want to know what behavior certain components are going to have. Like, it's going to act a certain way in a sidebar, but it's going to behave differently if it appeared in the middle of the page. So.
And Photoshop doesn't have rules. If you break one element, those changes don't cascade through the layout.
So this next slide is an example of like an old school style guide deliverable that you might do on a project as a designer. So I work this out in Photoshop, and then I drop it off to either the development team to do something with, or product manager.
But they quickly start making changes to the product. New widgets emerge, new forms of content emerge, and the old style guide doesn't work anymore. So this is very similar to the style guide, but now this is in HTML. So everything, all the variations that you made in the previous slide now exist in our current slide, but editing them is as easy as sort of copying and pasting the code. You're not trying to recreate something all over again in another language. And we like to refer to it as like, it's like the concept of a reset, but it has branding in it. So you're basically resetting all the regular markup from headers to paragraphs to form elements, and you're giving them a branded look and feel.
So this is a pattern library that's it's active code. It's HTML and CSS that a developer, I can start grabbing this code right away, using the buttons, using the forms. It's a living being that I can start prototyping if I need to, and start getting this in front of the client really soon.
So everybody loves designing in Source. The process benefits everybody. The client from day one starts to see the actual thing. They're not saying, oh, it's pretty and then it got ugly again. Why was it pretty yesterday and now it's simple again? They're seeing it as it's growing. So there's no lag time between showing a comp or a proof and showing the finished product.
And you could start getting immediate feedback from how the designs are converting into code. You can see if you need to adjust the button color a little bit, or the actions of certain elements, you can make those tweaks right in the pattern library.
And you can tell them to look at it on their computer and their phone, and they're not. You don't have two files. You have one file. Just real quick. Yeah. The designer has more work to do. Oh, sorry. And that's good. We're running out of time. Sorry. And the developer also benefits. Yeah, it's great.
So just recap a little bit here. So,
Oh, sorry. Oh, no. So content, we're by putting our content first, we're cutting out some of the BS that comes with designing gridded layouts. When you respect the content and you've got to have good language, you don't have widgets and sidebars to distract people. Your content has to be good. So that's good for everybody.
I think the important thing to note is we have our mobile-first design at this state, and our stakeholders can see if their goals are being met.
And this object-based, this thinginess way of thinking actually does help your designer and developer talk to each other. I'm not going to commit the cardinal sin and call it object-oriented because we'll talk about that later. But it does help people talk about things, objects, as if, yeah.
So how many people know about the Genesis framework and are actively using it? So Genesis is an incredible tool that's a WordPress theme framework, which allows you to basically have a bunch of package functionality within a theme that you can then leverage. The way WordPress, Genesis was created by a company called StudioPress. Genesis sits as a parent theme, and then you do all your custom coding in a child theme. So we like Genesis. We use Genesis in this process. So I'm sorry, these are kind of faint. But there's a really fantastic plugin written by Christopher Cochran that's called the Genesis Visual Hooks Guide. And this just is a great developer plugin. You just install it onto your site and you turn it on, and you can get this incredible view of where the hooks within Genesis fall. So these hooks are hooks that, as a theme developer, you tap into. And so you can get a sense of where the header is, where the grant has some.
All this talk about breaking our design into pieces, was for a reason, is to get to this place. Now that we know what a piece is, now we know what a part is, now we can start to see we have a map of where to put those parts and pieces within the flow.
And each of these blocks of content that's output is like a little event inspiring. We can tap into that event and add things. Maybe we want a subtitle underneath the title. Give us an idea of how to order.
So what you see on this slide, hook it up, is all that work we did on content and the content hierarchy. We're going to lay that next to the Genesis Visual Hooks Guide, and we can see where I'm going to put my headers, my articles within the Genesis framework.
And if we zoom in, we can see how powerful Genesis is, or this sort of parts and pieces logic. If we write our parts and plan them well enough, we can actually nest repeated parts within parts to create more complex pieces.
So of the theme developers in the room, how many of you are using template parts? Great. So template parts is just a built-in functionality within WordPress that allows you to write drier code. You can use reusable blocks of code within your applications. So what we're looking at here is we're trying to get a parts inventory and how it aligns with the hooks within Genesis.
So basically, these three terms refer all to the same process. Your hook is where your developer's looking to put that custom piece of content. Your partial is what your front-end developer is writing to be a discrete, independent element so that it can be placed wherever it needs to be, depending on the user flow, user story, or template. And then the component is the conceptual idea that the designer's working with in order to, again, design this thing that changes size according to its function.
When we start to see content as discrete blocks that we can move around, it really frees us up from thinking layouts have to determine how things go and how things are ordered and how things are coded. And we have a lot more flexibility to change and adjust as a project develops and as new priorities come forward.
It's doing away with this feeling of I need a sidebar or I need widgets. Like notice we didn't ever mention sidebar or widgets. Just you're thinking more in terms of components of content that you're displaying within your website. So now we're going to develop, with all this sort of touchy-feely stuff, we're going to develop the empathy between the designer and the developers.
So these are screenshots of a project that Antonio and I worked on for NYU. There were some complex interactions that were taking place, and we had screenshots, and they only did so much. So there's an off-canvas event that's happening here that's firing another event that's then firing all these child events, and there's only so many wireframes you can look at before you need to see the thing move. And so Antonio and I actually had to have a conversation, and we had to talk about it to figure out how this thing moves.
Yeah, exactly.
So basically, we had no one deliverable that was the finished project that we handed off. We had screenshots that described the physical characteristics of the objects, and we had a prototype that described the mechanical actions, but we never delivered the final product. Their developers, using some really complicated technology, had to build the final product. So that's the kind of, that only comes out of this kind of collaboration that we're talking about, this conversation. The only thing that makes that possible is a breaking down of these barriers.
Yeah, I mean, one of the examples with the event-driven stuff, Jesse and I had a lot of conversation back and forth where Jesse spoke to some of the interactions that may happen. You know, a user's going to tap on the text, and then it's going to add a bookmark, and then there's things that happen off canvas. And as a developer, that made me start thinking and interpreting that as like event-based driven actions that happen in JavaScript, for example. So I worked in a lot of the pub/sub system within this link, within this application. So they're like, yeah, as a user was tapping on the text, the off-canvas stuff would just tap into actions that happened on the on-canvas stuff, and then as users were able to switch back into the off-canvas stuff, all that stuff was already updated because it's all nice.
It's a great example of the visual designer and the developer sharing the hat of the user experience.
Well, it's the idea that we couldn't have, no one of us could have built this. I didn't know what the technology could do, and Antonio just doesn't have any good ideas. No. It was only through conversation that we could figure out what was going to happen. Like, I couldn't design it, and he couldn't design it. Like, we had to design it. So basically, the cool part about interaction design or interactive elements is that they allow for progressive enhancement, which means before I hand it off, it's got to be something. It's got to be a series of screens. But this idea that this sort of like magic can happen, like in conversation, these just-in-time events that only happen when two people see the same thing and recognize it as something.
Well, and it's always great. I always love working with designers who or just can throw up some stuff with JavaScript, just little interactions with all the great little JavaScript libraries. For me as a developer, I know how to write JavaScript, but I don't know how to like storyboard the interactions. And so a designer who can like prototype that out, I don't care what the code looks like, but they can train me what the end product is supposed to look like.
Yeah, we have to be in the same room at the same time. Have to.
So while all this is going on, Antonio's been busy working on the development environment.
Yes. So development environment. So in the past, when Jesse, Michael, and Grant and I first started working together, we had to sort of figure out a good way to share project files and then get the actual development environment up and running on our individual machines. So in the past, we would pull down the project. We'd install dependencies. Like in this case, we were dependent on Sass and Compass. Share database dump file, and then synchronize the local database with that dump. Probably do some updates, especially in WordPress, where you update the site URL to make sure that it's up and running with your local site URL. Configure and start the local web server, and then pray. And then if something didn't work, you'd refresh the browser, and then troubleshoot. Next. And then repeat step 5.
Basically meant Antonio is at my machine a lot because I can't do any of this stuff.
And Grant happens to be using PHP 5.4 when I'm on 5.3 and doesn't know why he's getting a warning and I'm not.
Who's set up a local development environment before or project working on? Who's had it go perfectly every time? You're amazing. You can learn from you.
Do you work? Is it always you working on it? No. Okay. So what we discovered is that this is a time-consuming process. Troubleshooting, figuring out what versions are off, just figuring out what dependencies we have installed. This can become a nightmare. So what we opted to doing is going into using virtual machines. Who here knows what a virtual machine is? Good show of hands. I guess a good way to
Who
explain.
has used virtual machines for WordPress
Vir-
development? Job.
Cool.
Right.
All right, a few of you. Who has shared a virtual machine? All right. So we decided, I think the better workflow is to just put everything on a virtual machine, install our dependencies on that, including Ruby, Sass, and Compass, because Jesse, do you know how to install Ruby? No. Okay, so we'll move on from that. Just a freaking cowboy. And then we also ensure that we share our local folder path on the physical machine with a virtual machine, so that Jesse can continue working in Coda, I can continue working in Sublime Text, and he can continue working in Text Wrangler. All right. So this actually puts us all on the same page. We have all our our development environments match. Frameworks are all the same because it's all on a virtual machine. Our databases are in sync and our uploads files are in sync. So there's no nightmare in terms of getting up and running.
Can you explain what the virtual item?
Oh, I'm sorry.
We're going to demo that.
Yeah, we're going to show. A virtual machine is essentially a computer on your computer. It's a virtual computer in your computer. That's basically how your web hosts work. That's why it's so cheap to get web hosting these days, because they're all virtual. So the tool we use for that is Vagrant. Who has heard of Vagrant? A few of you, I'm sure. Cool. Vagrant. Yeah. Oh, not the least.
How much does it cost?
It's free. It's open source. And it's super easy to install. So with Vagrant, what one of us does is, for example, me, I'll go in and configure a virtual machine, and then I'll provision it. And by provision, I mean get all the dependencies installed, like Apache, MySQL, Ruby, Sass, and Compass. And then I'll package it up with Vagrant with a simple command, Vagrant package, and then I'll upload it to a server. In this case, I'll put it on an Amazon Web Service server using S3. Next thing, I have Michael, Jesse, and Grant install Vagrant, download and install Vagrant, and in a virtual machine. And VirtualBox is also free and open source. And the great thing about both Vagrant and VirtualBox is that they can run on pretty much any OS, I would say, Windows, Mac OS X, and Linux. So it sort of puts us gets us into a platform agnostic development setup. Next thing we do is we'll pull down a project, and Vagrant has a Vagrant config file that comes with that Vagrant will read when it starts up the virtual machine or starts up the process. And that config file has the actual location of the box that we've packaged up and put on S3. And after the developers pull down the box, we'll just run the simple Vagrant up command with the provision flag. Jesse can handle that, right? Okay. And then what Vagrant will do is it'll say, cool, is this box installed on the local machine? If it's not, it'll go up and fetch it. And then we'll start provisioning it with a provisioning script. Again, provision, setting up all the dependencies on the machine. And then we add additional scripts like Compass Watch. Just start watching the project so the developers can start working. Cool. So we're going to demo this.
That
real
all
quick.
sounded really hard, Antonio. Let's see if that is actually as easy as you say.
All right.
So why don't you guide me through the process here of what I'm supposed to do?
So Michael, I need you to pull down the latest version of the project.
All right, so I'm going to go into the project file,
And you're going to do a git pull.
which happens to be called, this is the site we made for you tonight. So I'm going to do a git pull. This is the git pull to the repository.
Great, you already
And it
did
looks like I'm already up to date.
Yeah, how about you list out the files real quick? Just so we can show the Vagrant file that you see on the left side there. That's the Vagrant config that Vagrant looks for when you run the command.
Oh, run the command.
Vagrant up. And provision.
So what's happening?
It's gonna explode. All right, so what's happening here is Michael has already done his due diligence and downloaded the machine. And what's happening now is Vagrant is getting ready to set up the machine, and it's already provisioned it. So you only want to provision once. You don't want to reinstall Apache every time you run the Vagrant up command. But it'll start sharing your local development folder, which is this project folder.
So I don't have to SSH into some crazy VM?
No, don't even have to know what it is.
Wow.
And then there's a script that Vagrant will trigger that will start watching the Compass project that we have in the child theme.
It's doing some stuff.
Yep. So now you see that it tells you to bring up the site and that great IP address, which is a local IP address that is dedicated to that virtual machine.
Let's just see what this looks like. I don't really believe him.
And there's the site. That's
Wow.
how good our work is.
Hey, it's responsive out of the box.
Jesse's designs.
So as a developer, what do I have to do to start working on this?
Well, let's make a style change. And Sass style change. Let's just change the background color.
Not crazy about that orange.
Let's darken it up. So as you can see, Compass was watching a project in the background, and it took, if we were to download the server, it would probably have taken about 30 minutes to get set up and running. So we've improved our workflow.
And if you're not using Sass, you might have been making changes to your Sass file, wondering why they're not showing up.
Compass watch, Jesse. Compass watch.
It's the only reason I turn on terminal on the machine.
It also ensures that we're all speaking, like I said, speaking the same language. So I know if Jesse's having a problem, I more than likely know that it's not anything to do with the environment. It's probably just his code.
And we're back. So Grant, would you like to talk about what happens next?
Sure. So as we're setting up a development environment, we also want to be thinking about optimizing the code that we're building and preparing it, getting ready to launch it to production. And so part of what that means is when a web page is loaded, all of the images, all of the scripts, all the styles are individual internet requests, HTTP requests to get additional files. And we really like to minimize those number of requests because that helps the page load much faster. So there's really, for most sites, no reason to load more than one style sheet or one JavaScript file with all of the styles and all of the JavaScript we need. So we like, and obviously we don't want to manually be pasting JavaScript into one file. We can automate that process, and we like a tool called Grunt for this, which is an automated task runner. And it handles all kinds of things. One reason it's really nice is that it's modular. There are a number of plugins, so we can say, all right, we want to concatenate, combine multiple files into one. We want to minify the resulting one file, so it's just all one line, no spaces, as small as it can possibly be. And maybe we want to do some hinting or linting as we're building our code, so it helps catch errors and help us
use best practices. So we can select those 3 plugins, set up grunt, and as we simply run grunt from the command line or set up grunt watch in the similar way that we're watching Compass, and we can automatically minify those files. And what's great about this is we can tell it to watch a whole folder. So you can see there's kind of an example project folder style here. We're putting all of our jQuery plugins in a plugins folder under the JavaScript section, and it's going to automatically build all those plugins into one _plugin.js file. And then we put our custom script in _scripts.js. That's a just normally unminified file. And then when we load that into our site, we set a conditional and say, if we're in a local environment, we want both those because we want to be able to debug and look line by line and set places to stop the code as we're working with it. But when we're loading it from a production server, we just want that one file. So we load just a single minified script, and then there's only one file that's loaded.
Why would we want to do that and not just add it?
Not just what?
Why would we want to work with this type of environment and not always just activate minify everything?
Oh, well, it can be a little tough. If you ever try to debug minified JavaScript, everything's on one line. So it will say, error, line 1. And somewhere in those thousands of characters, there's an error, which is really hard to see. So that's why.
So can you do additional things like help us with caching issues?
It can help you with caching issues. You can do automatic image spriting. You can build font icon libraries. There are literally hundreds of different tasks you can do.
So we should probably also mention you should make sure your production environment is ready. This is just doing your due diligence up front, making sure, I think we've all probably been there. You get to the last week and you don't know who controls the domain. So these are things that you should ask up front. So we also, we're big proponents of using WP managed host providers. Shout out to WP Engine. We really like them. They're one of the sponsors. There's great ones. ZippyKit is also really great. Pagely. These are all really great. And they just provide really fantastic customer support as well as that the site is hosted in a cloud environment. So if there's a big spike in traffic, it's going to be able to handle that. And so they're a little extra money, but they're definitely worth it. So let's plug it in. So WordPress is really a robust CMS at this point. So in sort of the final stages of what we're going to talk about is just enhancement layers. So a couple of our favorites is using a class by a gentleman named Demas called WP Alchemy. WP Alchemy is a fantastic abstraction to writing custom meta boxes. So what it does is the class takes care of all the work of saving meta boxes, and it allows the HTML to be completely abstracted from that. So the way that looks, well, I also should mention that I really love the documentation. I really appreciate plugins, and in this case, a class that is really well documented. So you can create, I'm sorry, this is small. You can create a meta box that, in this case, this is a meta box for a post type for a property. It's a real estate site. They have properties and neighborhoods and agents. So this is a pretty complex meta box that we generated really quickly using WP Alchemy. So this is the code that we had to write in order to, this is an excerpt of the code we had to write, but you can see very easily just in each of those paragraph tags, there's just a label for the display, there's the field call, and then the input type, just the HTML input type. And this is a very clean abstraction of creating these meta boxes. Another big,
you don't have to worry about saving meta content?
Nope.
You don't have to hook into anything?
No, you don't have to do anything special. The class is going to handle all of that. It's just redundant code that, like, if you've written a few of these, you notice there's just like chunks of code that is just over and over you're going to use. Well, this class just kind of bundles that all up. So I highly recommend checking that out. There's another one we really like that sort of ties things together called Post to Post. Post to Post was written by Scribu and Alex. And what that it really does launch WordPress into this robust CMS land where you can create these relationships to your custom posts. So in the case of this real estate site we have a properties post type, we have neighborhoods, and we have facts about those properties and neighborhoods. And so we were able to create those relationships using this plugin very, very easily. And so what we've done here is we've created a relationship between properties and neighborhoods. And in those cases, there's a many properties to one relationship cardinality. And then facts to neighborhoods, we've created a relationship. So facts would be like, there's a park in this neighborhood, the Apollo Theater is in this neighborhood, some historic reference about the neighborhood. So in this case, facts to neighborhood, there's a many to one relationship, one neighborhood, many facts. And then facts to properties, we have many to many, so many facts about many different properties. So it's
that same modular logic comes back to play here, where a lot of simple content types can be assembled to form a complex display.
So from the admin side, the people who are managing this content, it's just a very, very easy admin panel where you just select. The top one would be neighborhoods. It's very similar to just adding tags to posts. So this would be the edit property screen. And I've created my relationship between properties and neighborhoods. So I see the neighborhood content, the neighborhood post type, and then I can just add a neighborhood. Facts, since there's many to many relationships, facts, I can just start creating more connections. And in this case, this is kind of a more recent, maybe within the last 6 months or something. He's also added the ability to attach post types to users, which I think is really powerful.
This becomes really handy when you want to do things like maybe see all the properties in a particular neighborhood, or maybe use multiple authors, attach multiple WordPress users to a particular post. It becomes very easy to create those relationships and query the resulting data.
So let's set up our deployment and build process, Grant.
All right, so maybe before you've if you've ever worked with deployment over something like a VPS, you might have SSH into the server, and maybe you're pulling down a Git repository, or maybe setting up a Git hook or something like that. Those ways work okay, but we like to automate things. If we're doing the same thing over and over again, deploying the updates that we've made to a site, let's make it automatic so that we're not manually going through that process and wasting time that could be condensed. So there's sort of two avenues here. We mentioned WordPress hosting and WordPress managed hosting, and WP Engine really has an excellent Git deployment system. If you're looking to use managed hosting, I recommend them for that reason alone. You can basically upload all of the changes since the last time you uploaded, and it will copy it automatically into your site. And it all managed with Git, which is a great version control system. If you choose to do that, recommend letting WP Engine handle the versioning of WordPress core. And in that case, if you're including WordPress, the WordPress files themselves in your repository, you'll probably want to take the WP content folder, which has your themes and plugins, the things that you're customizing, and have that as a submodule for your site. And that way you can not touch core on your site. WP Engine takes care of updating that, but just upload the things you've customized through the WP content folder. You can also, if you're doing optimizations like we talked about with grunt, you often aren't going to include those minified JavaScript and CSS files in your version control system because they're going to change every time you make changes to the CSS and the JavaScript. So grunt has some FTP deployment tasks where you can automate building and uploading those minified files to your production or staging or development server. If you're not using managed hosting, or maybe you have your own test server, Capistrano is an excellent tool for automated deployment, and it allows us to set up similar processes for multiple servers. So it really helps us be efficient. Maybe we want to upload changes to a test environment, maybe to a staging, maybe even to a production server, and we can do that all with the same setup. So why we love Capistrano: we're using Git, so we're only uploading the things that we have changed. Gone are the days of dragging the entire folder over and copying over by FTP or SFTP every single file in the project. Whoops, that deployment broke the site. There's a simple command, cap deploy rollback, and it will immediately switch back to the previous version of the site, and we can correct any errors that happen. It gives us the ability to remote control a local server or a remote server from our local environment. So we don't have to deal with manually SSHing in. We can actually let Capistrano do it for us and run the tasks that we tell it. It also gives us an easy way to separate the files that are in version control, like our code, from the files that are not, such as image uploads. We usually don't include image uploads in a Git repository, and Capistrano lets us easily handle deployment around those files. And as I said, there are multi-stage options, so you can set it up to work from multiple servers. So Capistrano, if you've ever sort of first used it, it seems a little bit of a mystery. The documentation can be slightly esoteric. So to walk you through briefly how the folder structure on the server looks like, there are 3 folders. There's a releases folder which holds all of the updates. Every time you push updated code to the server, a new date timestamp release folder is created, and all of the project code goes into that folder. There's also a shared folder, and that's the place where we put things like our image uploads, the things that don't change between releases. We keep them all in one place there. And then the final is the current folder. And current is where the magic happens, because current isn't actually a folder itself. It's a symlink to the most recent release.
What is a symlink?
A symlink is short for symbolic link. It's basically a pointer that says point to these other folders. So it lets us keep that name current. The name of the site, the place that our site lives, will always be called current, but what files it's actually pointing to will change every time we release a new set of files.
So almost like a shortcut?
Yeah, like a shortcut. A shortcut or an alias if you've used those in Windows or Mac OS. And we have a series of commands. These are some that Capistrano gives us. Once we set up our initial configuration, we can just do cap deploy setup, and it will set up the deployment folder structure for us. We can check and make sure that the server has the dependencies we need. And I mentioned rollback, and then cap the multi-stage. We can say cap production deploy, or cap staging deploy, or cap test deploy. And we usually set cap deploy to go to our test server in case we forget to include which server we're deploying to. And so finally, just to show you a snippet of the Capistrano configuration code, it's fairly straightforward. We're basically giving an application name. We're telling where's the Git repo that hosts that file, or hosts our project, where should it access, where should it place that project, what folder on the remote server that we're deploying to, and we control what tasks we're running.
What is this language?
This is Ruby. And then once we have set up the configuration, we tell it what tasks we want to do. So a common task that we're going to run every time we deploy is we're going to make those symlink those shared files, such as our uploads folder, to the current project folder, to the current release folder. And that way our uploads are never going to have to live in the release folder. They'll have their own happy home in the shared folder. And basically, whenever we run Capistrano, what happens is it logs into our server for us. It says, hey, Git, are there any updates? And pulls in any updates from the Git repository. And then it pulls those into the release folder and points the current symlink to that new release folder. So it handles all that for us automatically.
Wow, with all that talk about release, it sounds like we're ready. It sounds like we're ready for release, huh? Well, release is optional. The internet is never done. Sometimes the client is just not ready. And sometimes you've done all this hard work and they just want to go for another week. Maybe they want to tune their content for a while. They want to talk to some additional people. Well, don't let that influence your timeline. We've changed our philosophy around developing and designing for testable outcomes. If we're satisfied with that, then we don't have to release. The internet's never done.
How many of you have ever worked on a site where there was always just one more thing to do before it was ready to deploy, or was ready to launch? So we like to introduce the idea that it doesn't have to be completely everything, every single thing ready. If the client isn't ready, then we can wait. So
introducing the product cycle. So the product cycle is just an iterative rinse and repeat cycles. These are just like sprints in any agile project. We'll continue to focus in the same pattern of developing based on outcomes. And there'll just be a series of enhancements. If it's just a change of thinking of like your products can just keep cycling. So in conclusion, unicorns are cool. There's a lot of talk about unicorns, but friends are better. Know your personal strengths and when to ask for help. Because this collaboration, this wouldn't work unless we were willing to say, hey, I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. And develop empathy for the talents of others. There's too much great stuff out there that it's just hard to know everything. So in the end, you're going to have a stronger product. You're going to come across less roadblocks in the process. You're shifting the development from deliverables to outcomes. You move away from this cover your ass mentality of designing a development, which is frankly just more fun. So we're going to leave you. We spoke a lot about different resources. These slides are online. I'll post them to the Meetup. But we just left you with a whole series of resources, design, interface, and development. So thank you very much. We appreciate your attention. And now we're going to play ping pong.
So we have just a few minutes for questions. So if you have any questions from the audience, would someone volunteer to pass the mic to those who have questions?
Okay, well. How do you guys handle syncing of the database between you?
That's a great question. That's oftentimes we have. That's oftentimes a really difficult challenge when you're working with both technical and non-technical people. So in the example that we showed you, or that Antonio created, he actually did a little bit of a cheat of putting the SQL within the repository, the Git repository, which is all right if it's a tiny database, but not a good long-term solution. So his long-term solution is?
My long-term solution would have been to, I actually did install on the machine the WordPress CLI library. And what I was going to do was fetch, if we actually had a staging server, I would have fetched the database from the staging server and then sync that with the local development server, and then use the CLI command line to go and search and replace the staging server's URL with the local development environment URL. It would have done that properly. So that's
a single command that would just
it would just do it all. Yeah.
It's another place where Capistrano can be helpful is kind of our remote command toolkit, as we can give it define a task to go fetch databases and bring them locally.
Way in the back.
Great, thank you. First and foremost, really great presentation. You obviously put a lot of time and effort into it, so thank you so much for doing that and for sharing. It's very generous of you to do that. So,
Thank you.
Secondly, who handles the business side of things? Contracts, pricing.
Like user experience.
Great.
It's a shared role.
Okay, so you spoke a lot about the technical and the consulting process. To the degree you're comfortable, what is a project budget for something, for all this process that you talked about, an average range, and then for me, what percent is the front end consulting of that? Because it seems like there's less and less appetite for that front end consulting piece. So what's the total project budget and what percent is the consulting? How do you sell that?
Okay, it is difficult to sell when you tell somebody that any figure that you give them today is not going to be valid tomorrow. So basically we give them is we sell bandwidth of time. So we sell bandwidth of a resource. We don't sell deliverables. We don't sell features. We sell resources, a pair of hands on deck. And we get done in 2-week cycles. and everybody's kept abreast of what the backlog is. And so basically it means you're going to have the product person at the table every morning. But it also means they're well aware of the progress of the project every day. So it means a little bit more of like over-the-shoulder watching, but they're aware of how difficult things are. And so they understand that 2 weeks is 2 weeks. And yeah, so we stopped pricing features.
I think after Jesse and I worked together as Mr. Machine for a couple years, we just got kind of fed up with spending lots of time doing detailed proposals, and then 2 weeks into the project, we've completely strayed from the deliverables that were listed and priced out in that proposal. It put us in a situation of being sort of bad cop on a project, where we'd have to be telling the client what's best for them, which is not really great for a project. So we wanted to really build in that flexibility, but it's a harder sell for sure. And getting back to your first question about who does the business development, we find that it's very important that we are all able to sell, because if you can't sell what you do, then where's the passion? How can you convince anybody into giving you some money for it, or giving you something else for it?
And that's not to say that we make less, like we're cautious when we tell people the features. We still get it all done. And we still pride ourselves in working harder than we have to, because we like what we do. It just means everybody's at the table, so everybody knows what like 1 hour is worth.
Yeah, I just want to echo what my friend here said. It's a great presentation. I've been on all sides of what you just presented, so I can see real value of what you presented. We work with a lot of clients, from some people who just say, just call us when it's done and we'll pay you, till some enterprise clients who dedicate to developers to just work with us. So how do you integrate the two developers from the client side into your development? And what's the easiest way?
Well, one of the deliverables that we've carved out, there was another question about markup and how markup gets squashed on the design side. The way that we've been able to sort of like salvage control over the visuals and sell more than Photoshop files and work with developers is securing a pattern library as a deliverable. And the way that works is it's actually checked out as a separate sub-project of the map, and the technical fellows like. But it allows us to maintain like a sandbox where we can test and use and expand on the visual language of the thing in markup and deliver it, and not interrupt the primary workflow of the application, or not have to deal with all the dependencies of the application. So we're still going to have burnable code, because a lot of times we're building like a JavaScript prototype to sort of like, you know, kind of simulate a lot of these actions, a lot of these mechanicals that are happening. But the more we work on it, our prototype gets smarter, and the part that we burn burns away cleaner.
So just to add to that, I mean, we've all, I think, we work on other projects besides just WordPress projects. You know, we work with Rails team, we work with Django teams, and what's great that there's all these really interesting like lightweight frameworks that are coming online. Like we've been working with Ember lately. It's a JavaScript framework. There's an Ember app kit that if you're building front ends, it largely it maps to working with a Rails project, for example. So it's like you're working in something that's very familiar with the development team already. So there's a little less, there's more empathy.
It's also one of the hopes of what Vagrant's supposed to do, right? More often is the developer is able to, we don't have to ramp up on all the dependencies of that system. If they can snapshot it in this sort of virtual space, at least we can have a reasonable emulation of the system that our front-end components are walking into. Yeah.
Well, time for one more question, I think. Is there another question?
Do you have the address, the web address that you were going to share with us?
For the slides? It will be posted in the comments of this meetup afterwards.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. All right.
Sweet.
Well, thank you again all for coming.
Thanks.